Good morning, everyone. My name is Sabrina, and today I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Joyce. Professor Joyce is a professor of economics here at Wellesley and serves as the faculty director of the Albright Institute. He teaches courses in macroeconomic theory and international macroeconomics, and I was lucky enough to be in his intermediate macroeconomic course about a year ago, and that's where it became clear exactly why he was awarded the Pinansky Teaching Prize in 2014. Professor Joyce received his BSFS degree cum laude in International Affairs from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and an MA and PhD from Boston University in economics. Professor Joyce's research deals with issues in financial globalization. His book, The IMF and the Global Financial Crises, Phoenix Rising, has been published by the Cambridge University Press. Additionally, he's published many articles, including the Journal of Development Economics and World Development. Please join me in welcoming Professor Joyce.
Thank you, Sabrina. I was going to mention a word or two about the introductions, and Sabrina's was absolutely pitch perfect. That when you introduce someone, you need not mention every single facet about their lives. What you really should try to do is kind of hit the key 5 bullet points, if you like. And you did it exactly correctly. So Sabrina, very, very well done, and thank you for that. I'll mention as one act of biographical trivia that today, 24 years ago today, I was married on the Wellesley College campus on a day when it was freezing rain, sleet, snow. Some of our guests literally couldn't get out here. Why did we get married in January? I can't remember. At the time, why didn't we wait till June like normal people? I have no idea. But I showed up at the church at the chapel here on campus, and the priest was there, my wife-to-be was there, I was there. I figured, what the hell, let's do it. And we did indeed get married, and 24 years later, it seemed to have worked, so the bad weather didn't slow us down. So today I'm very pleased to be here to talk about inequality. And inequality is an issue that, as you'll realize as we talk, generates a lot of strong reaction and opinions. And all I'd like to do this morning is do 3 things. Kind of give you some of the basic facts and trends about inequality, tell you a little bit about the research that's been done about the impact of globalization upon inequality, and then discuss with you some of the benefits and costs to society that inequality has. Okay? So let's start off by literally measuring inequality. Inequality means the difference, if you like, in the levels of income or wealth, because we could talk about either, that occurs amongst people within a particular segment of the world, usually a nation. So think about a nation where you have different people, different income levels, and the question is, how big is the gap between those at the top of the income scale and those at the bottom? We can try to give a measurement to inequality by using something called the Lorentz Curve. So over here, I'd like to show you how a Lorentz Curve is brought up. It is a very basic graph, okay? And on the x-axis, we do something a little odd. We start here and we move to the right. And what we do is imagine that we had the income data for a particular group, such as a country, and we line people up by income. And on this end, imagine literally we did it on the first row, we put the very poorest person, followed by the next poorest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As we move along, obviously, we're getting into the richer parts of society. And so way down there, where Vivian is sitting, she's the richest member of society. So we start at 0 and move up to 100%. Okay? As we do that, we're measuring income, okay? And we accumulate the income as we go along. So we start with the first 1% and ask this person, or find out, how much of national income do you receive? And she gives us a number. We go to the second person. How much do you receive? We then add together the portions of the first 2 people, the third person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until clearly at the end, obviously, we have accounted for all the amount of income in society. All right? That is what a Lorentz curve is. Let me show you 2 hypothetical Lorentz curves. Start down here at 0, and imagine in situation number 1 that we live in a very interesting society in which literally everybody receives the exact same amount of income. And in a case like that, when we line people up, it would be somewhat irrelevant where they were because they all get the same income. But then what would the Lorentz curve look like? Well, we'd start with the first 1% person and say, how much of income do you receive? And if we imagine that there was literally 1 person for each percent, the first 1% would say, I receive 1% of income. Okay, good. So let's plot that. Go to the second group. How much do you receive? Same, 1% if it's a person, okay? 1 and 1 is 2. So now we're up to here. And imagine now as we go along, 3%, 4%, 5%, we're plotting those observations. At the end, we're going to show all the observations. Not going to be quite a straight line because I'm using my hand to draw it, but imagine that it was, okay? And it would look something like this. It's a little bowed out. Let me try again. Here we go. Bingo, I think I got it that time. That would be a Lorentz curve for a society where there was literally total equality. Everybody received the exact same. Now let's do the exact opposite situation. Imagine a society in which, don't ask me how this would happen, but mathematically it could happen. The first 99% did not receive any income. Literally all the income went to the upper 1%. And if we plotted the Lorentz curve, it would look something rather odd like that. It would run along this axis all the way up to the 99th percentile, and then all of a sudden it would jump up like this. And we would have total inequality. Okay? Those are two hypothetical situations. We can now go out and look at actual countries and plot their Lorentz curves, and as you can probably guess, they'll fall somewhere in between. We're never going to see perfect equality. We're never going to see perfect inequality. So imagine going out and doing this exercise for different types of populations, and you would see figures that might look something like these. Okay, so there's just two that I'm just drawing at freehand. Notice, in comparison to the perfect equality, perfect inequality, the more bowed out you are, the more unequal, the more you're approaching that type of situation. On the other hand, the closer you are to the red line here, then clearly the more equal you are. Okay, so just hypothetically imagine doing that for different individuals, for different societies, okay? And we get their Lorentz curves, and we could show them, but of course, then we need to have some sort of space to literally show the different curves. It's a little easier if I could then reduce the Lorentz curve to a number, and we can, and it's called the Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient is simply based on the actual Lorentz curve for a particular nation. And what the Gini coefficient is simply the ratio of the area underneath some actual Gini curve. Let's choose this one. The ratio of that area to the area of the total inequality situation. So it's the ratio of the actual Lorentz curve for a particular nation vis-a-vis that of the total inequality situation. So right away, it's a number, and it'll range between 0 and 1. The closer it is to 1, the more unequal the society, because the more you're looking at that right angle type of total inequality. The smaller the Gini coefficient, then the more equal distribution is, because you're closer to the red line of total inequality. Okay, good. So that's the data that we can use to look at and compare inequality across nations. Once we know what the number is, you can imagine we can go out and start actually getting it. And then we could look at Gini coefficients, for example, across nations to compare the levels of inequality that we might see. I will tell you that nations in Europe have Gini coefficients between 0.24 and 0.36, where 0.5 is seen as once you're getting up to that point, things are getting pretty unequal. Okay, so below the 0.5. United States, 0.36. Okay, again, I'm just giving you a flavor for what the numbers might look like. The coefficients are usually higher for countries that are middle income and lower income. So the highest Gini coefficients are usually found in Latin America and the Caribbean, where the average is 0.48, practically the 0.5 that I said is kind of an arbitrary cutoff for where things get really high. For sub-Saharan Africa, it's 0.44. Okay, so it's very easy to look this data up. If you were really curious to find it, you could easily go online and find the latest data for different countries. Okay, so that would show us what the Gini coefficients are for different countries. We might also be curious to know, how does the Gini coefficient evolve over time, or does it? And the answer is, well, yes, it does. Okay, so you could choose a particular country and go back for which time we have data, and then see every year what is that country's Gini coefficient and how is it evolving. What might we expect to see? Well, an economist by the name of Simon Kuznets thought about this, came up with an interesting concept. He said, well, if we looked at the Gini coefficient for a particular society And we looked at it over time as this particular society evolved in terms of the level of economic development from some, I'll call it zero in the sense of very, very low level. I'll just arbitrarily make it zero. And then we looked at the level of development over time. And we talked about this society growing economically from perhaps a very simple rural-based society where basically everybody was a farmer to a society where there was more industry and industry is growing, and we continue to move out along the right-hand side. Then Kuznets claimed if we looked at the Gini coefficients over time, they might look something like this. And so you can see that as the economy begins to grow, all of a sudden inequality begins to grow as well. Why? The story he told is that as you have industry begin to evolve, you'll have migration of workers from the lower productivity agricultural sector into the factories. And those workers will begin to receive more money than they did when they were working on the farm. So as we continue to develop, there will be inequality because of the new opportunities for the workers who are joining the new sectors of society. And you can tell at some point, we reach a maximum, and this is where we have maximum inequality. But Kuznets claimed, as we continue to develop along this direction, you can see that the curve begins to come down, and inequality drops. And so the notion is that there's some period of maximum inequality. Then, as there are fewer and fewer people left in the agricultural sector, as the manufacturing sector grows, as the service sector grows, that the amount of inequality left in society will begin to come down. That's obviously an idealized curve that I drew for you, but I think you get the point of what Kuznets was claiming. Okay? Nice theory. Get a curve name for yourself, always a good thing in economics. Okay? But the actual historical pattern has been somewhat different. That when we look at countries that had high levels of development, like the US, like Western Europe, we do see that there has been inequality, that it did fall for a while in the mid-20th century, but since that time it seems to be rising again. So clearly, Kuznets' curve gives us some insight, but there's something missing over there on that curve. Okay? Luckily for us, someone's thought about this a great deal, and that man is a gentleman called Thomas Piketty. And Thomas Piketty is a French economist, okay, who this last year published this, yes, I admit, rather large book, called Capital in the 21st Century. Now, maybe that title doesn't grab you, but I tell you it grabbed economists because we knew what he was trying to do, to address this phenomenon of rising inequality and what was going on. And so Piketty has written this book, which seriously would make quite a, you may have heard about it the past year when it came out, was really very widely noted. Okay? And what Piketty does is to say, yeah, we did have inequality go down in the mid-20th century, but then it has begun to rise since then. And he documents in the book just how that has happened. Okay? He claims that inequality may indeed be a fundamental feature of capitalism. And he has a very simple story to tell about that. So let me take down the Kuznets curve. And what Piketty does is to say, well, in general, when we have situations where the rate of return on savings, or the rate of return on capital, which means what? Profits, dividends you get from stock you own in companies, interest you receive on bonds that you own, your wealth. So little r is the rate of return you earn on your wealth. When that rate of return is greater than the growth rate of the real economy, so G is simply a measure by how much output is changing year by year. Okay? When you have that situation, you will have increasing inequality because those who are wealthier are receiving a stream of income, okay, which actually makes them wealthy over time while the economy is throwing up maybe not so many chances for the less wealthy to be able to improve their situation. So this is a very simple story that he tells. In the 19th century, this story of R being greater than G, that situation did indeed prevail. And as a result, there were incredible rises in inequality in France, Britain, other parts of Western Europe, and the United States as well. So you may know in the United States, the period of the robber barons, for example. Okay? In Britain, clearly the aristocracy were growing richer and living in Downton Abbey and other beautiful places and enjoying wonderful lives. Okay? Then, Piketty says, within the 20th century, things change. You have 2 world wars, a massive Great Depression, and as a result, economies are shaken up, and governments come in, And the governments really intervene within the economies, particularly in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, to try to give more opportunities to those at the lower end of the income spectrum. And as a result, inequality actually falls during the mid-20th century. But since the 1970s or so, that situation has begun to reverse. That we seem to have more stagnating real economic growth, particularly in the last decade. Okay? Rate of return, therefore, on capital has risen above the economic growth rate. And we see a return to rising inequality that begins to look like the excesses of the late 19th century. Okay? So Piketty makes this argument, which I've just given to you a very bad capsule summary of it, and he makes it very well. And he's a very, very interesting guy, very well spoken. And I wish to heaven I could open the door and say, here's Mr. Piketty himself to come in, and he would love to present his work and explain it to you. Unfortunately, he's a bit busy these days. Because of his fame, he is being sought out at all sorts of different places. So I'm afraid I can't open the door and say, here is Mr. Piketty, please welcome him. But I can do the next best thing. Mr. Piketty gave a TED Talk, which lasts about 20 minutes. It is very, very well done. It's very interesting. He gives a much better explanation of his own work than I ever could. So I thought to do something a little different. Instead of my going on about the book, let him go on about his own book, because it'll be a lot more convincing than I ever will be. So let's open up the TED Talk and listen to Mr. Piketty for the next 20 minutes. Well, thank you, Mr. Piketty. I'm sorry he wasn't here. Maybe in future years we might get him. But I think he does, I will tell you, a really convincing job in the book of making the case you just heard about the changes in income distribution and wealth distribution that occurred particularly in the US and Britain and France over the last century or so. So I want to talk some more aspects of that. I do have a handout, so Allison, if you would start penning some out. And Sabrina, for the back of the room, here's some. Oh, and let me get one before I forget. Thank you. So I want to make very clear, I think Piketty makes a pretty good case. I haven't done any original research on this issue myself, but he convinces me. He was right, the last point, the data are there. It's very easy to get to the data that he uses in the book, so people can look at it on their end. What I want to point out, however, is that up to this point, every discussion we've had for the last, 45 minutes or so, has been about inequality within a nation, which is a kind of obvious first place to start. But there are other ways of trying to measure inequality on a more global basis. And so what I'd like to ask you to do is to think about inequality in the following sense. Instead of lining up people, suppose we lined up nations. And for each nation, we had an average income per capita, average amount of income per person, okay? And do the same type of Lorentz Curve simulation, except as I said, now it'll be the poorest nation. So it'll be Afghanistan, it'll be Somalia, it'll be some very poor country in the world. And then we start moving up in this direction to the right until at the end we're talking about the US and Norway, okay? So you can do that. You can do that type of work. By the way, the person who I'm talking about who's done the actual work, whose work I'm going to be citing, is another economist from the Balkans who has written a great deal about the global aspect of inequality, Branko Milinovic, who I believe is currently at NYU after being at the World Bank for many years. Okay? And if we do the Lorentz curve in the way that I just did, and if we calculate an international Gini coefficient, I will tell you that when you look at it over time, that you see little movement in it between 1960, when we first have data, up to the period of 1980. So there's no great change in inequality across countries when we look at that data during that period. But in 1980, we begin to see an interesting rise in this international Gini coefficient, and it continues to rise until about the year 2000, when it kind of seems to hit a plateau and might have come down a bit since then. Richer nations were growing faster than poorer nations. That's what it means, okay? That's an interesting time period because the 1980s is when the period of globalization began to take off. So if you take the notion of globalization becoming more common as countries trade with each other, as money crosses borders, and you tack to that the fact that I just told you that this particular international Gini coefficient begins to rise, showing more inequality, you might begin to say, gosh, globalization really only rewarded the richer nations. The poorer nations lost out, okay? But Milinovic would immediately say, but wait a minute. You just took each nation as the unit of observation and lined them up. That means you're giving the exact same weight to Belgium as you do to China. You really want to do that? And as soon as I pose the question, you might say, probably not. So you can go back to the calculation I just said, but now weighted by population. So think of all the countries lined up in the exact same way, but as you do the calculations, you are weighting them by the total population in that country. When you do that, it's a very interesting phenomenon. Again, you see little change between 1960 and 1980, but then in 1980, this international Gini coefficient begins to go down. And so we see less inequality around the world during this period of globalization. Why would that phenomenon take place? So I can give you the answer in two words. One word is China, and the second word is India. During the periods of the 1890s, these two countries began to have high growth rates. Those high growth rates brought everyone up within the populations. It wasn't just the upper levels, although, let me be careful, we can talk about within China, within India, income distribution, but I'm putting that aside. I'm saying that overall, everybody did benefit to some extent, which means that when you do the calculation for the international coefficient, and you give China and India the weight they should have given their population, you actually see a decline in global inequality during this period of globalization. Okay? Brankovic says that, by the way, there's a third way of doing the calculation, the Lorentz curve for the world, and that is to forget about boundaries, forget about countries, forget about where people live. Literally take the data we have for everyone in the world, to the extent we have that data, and of course we don't have it for everyone, but then line people up by the level of income with the very poorest person in the world, regardless of where she lives, then the next person, regardless of where she lives. In other words, forget about this notion of countries, think about people. And do not an international Gini coefficient, do a global Gini coefficient, where we don't care where people live. And when we line people up from the poorest to the richest, let me tell you the two things you'll notice when you do the calculations and see the data that Minimap predicts. Number one, which should not be surprised, when you do that global Gini coefficient, it's big. It's really, really high, okay? Is the gap between the richest person in the United States and the poorest person in the United States, or any other country you want, is going to be much smaller a gap than the richest person in the world, Warren Buffett, some Russian oligarch, who knows, and the poorest person, which, as I said, will be some probably person in sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, Central America. So that gap is going to be huge between people in the world, much larger than you would within any particular country. But point number two, that coefficient as well seems to be coming down. We seem to be seeing, again, when you look at that type of global inequality, we seem to see that the amount of distance between the very top and the bottom seems to be declining. So there seems to be some diminution in the amount of global inequality. Okay? Miliband got really interested in this aspect about whether or not things are changing when we look at people and kind of aggregate them across borders. And what he did was another set of calculations which looks a little bit like the Lorentz curve in the following sense. He did what I said just a minute ago, lined everybody in the world up by population as of 1988. So think about having the data that we have in 1988, and we line people up by their income in that year. Okay? But then on this axis, he doesn't do cumulative income in 1988. He does something different. He shows the increase in income for each group over the next 20 years. And that is the graph I've just distributed. So it's kind of like the Lorentz curve in the sense that if you look at the horizontal axis, there indeed is the percentiles of the income distribution. But notice that on the y-axis, we have the growth of income between the years of 1988 and 2008. And they do try to adjust for inflation and good things like that. Okay? And now the story he tells is a fascinating one. He has the groups divided by 5%. So the first dot is the lowest 5%, the next is the next 5%, et cetera, et cetera. And go across the graph, and what do you see? You see there is some income growth, some for the very poorest group of society, larger for the next 5%, and then all of a sudden as we hit the 30s, things began to take off. And for those who are in the, say, 40 to 60th percentiles of the global income distribution, they were the ones who received the largest increases in income per capita during this period of 1988 to 2008, which again, I would remind you, is correlated with globalization and increased globalization, okay? And Brankovic gives away the punchline that I would have said. I would have asked you, so who's that group in the middle? And he tells us who the group in the middle is. It's China's emerging middle class, who did very, very well during this period. I would add it's not just China, it's also India, maybe not quite as large an increase, but some increase. Indonesia, another big Asian country that usually is not talked about as much as India, but again, a very large country that's been doing pretty good in terms of income growth. And so as we see those areas of the globe have really large increases in income, we see that it lifts up their own lower classes. And as a result, as I said, if we go back to the global Gini coefficient, you do see this improvement. So the data is consistent. What I'm showing you on this graph is totally consistent with what Madeleine talked about on the global Gini. But wait, we're not done. Now let's jump up to what? The 70th percentile, 75th, 80th, and of course the line plunges. And again, I could ask you, who are we talking about now? Unfortunately, he already answered my question. We talk about, among others, the US lower middle class. So that group saw a very little increase in income during this period, barely positive. And again, keep going to the very, very top. And now I think you understand who we're looking at. We're looking at Piketty's group. Now we're looking at the very richest people within society. And they also benefited to an extraordinary amount during the period that we're just talking about. Okay? So the graph, I think in many ways, is very illuminating. It says that when we look at global inequality, it's complicated. There really seems to be some improvement for those, particularly those in the middle, that their position seemed to have increased really a lot over the last 20 years or so. But again, not everybody, not for the very poorest members of society. They have some increase, but not all that much. And again, for parts of the US, but also Western Europe, growth of income was not all that great. But again, as Piketty points out to us, yeah, but if you're in those countries doing really well, you did fabulously well during this period. So as a result, we can look at income and we can talk about income inequality. And I would stress to you that to really get a handle on it, you really need to take a global perspective. Again, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that Piketty is wrong. Quite the opposite. I have great admiration for the work that he's done. And this graph shows that when we look at the upper 1%, either within a nation or on a global basis, they've done very well over the last couple of decades. But as we look across countries and forget about national borders and look at people, we see there are other groups of people who seem to have been doing well as well. Okay? So now comes a question which I will tell you is very hard. If you can give a good answer to my question, you get a Nobel Prize in economics. Here's my question. Is there any relationship between this increase in income per capita for those who I'll call the Asian middle class, and the fact that the US lower middle class did not do so well? Is this a coincidence that one group is rising and another group is going down? And the fact that I'm raising the question tells you, maybe not. Maybe there is something going on in terms of how different groups did vis-a-vis each other. Okay? So now let me talk a little bit about the effect of globalization upon income equality and just what exactly we think the linkage is. There have been many studies done trying to talk about how globalization itself, this process of increasing markets to include trade across borders, finance across borders, whether or not it has helped or hindered equality within nations and across nations. Okay? I'm going to give you a very simple summary of some of the main studies that I know about, just because I found the results kind of interesting. One study was done down at the World Bank, and the researchers basically looked at a whole group of developing, now emerging market countries, that's the term we use, and divided them into the globalizers versus the non-globalizers. And the criterion they used, they actually had two criteria to use to try to figure out which camp a particular country fell into, was they looked in the 1970s at the amount of international trade that a country had. So I can't remember the arbitrary dividing line, but if you were above some line in terms of the amount of international trade that took place within your country, you were a globalizer. If you were below it, you were a non-globalizer. They also looked at whether or not countries cut tariffs. Tariffs are the taxes that we put on imports coming into a country, and obviously can slow down trade if we're taxing a lot of the foreign goods that come in. And again, countries that cut their tariffs in the 1970s, as you can guess, were the globalizers. Countries that didn't were the non-globalizers. So now we've got the, if you like, two groups lined up, and now they fast forward to the 1990s, so they jump up by 20 years or so. And they look at growth within these two groups, and growth within the globalizers is definitely higher higher than the non-globalizers. This group, which by the way included, not surprisingly, China and India, did indeed show faster growth than those that weren't growing, that were not seen as globalizers. Okay? And it wasn't just those two groups of nations. They also added in the advanced economies, the US, Western Europe, Japan, et cetera. Okay? And they found that even when you add in that as a third group, the globalizer emerging markets did better than the richer advanced income countries as well. So that would seem to indicate that globalization was doing a good thing for these countries. But remember, we're talking about not growth, we're talking about inequality. So they're not quite done. They went back to the data and then looked at the amount of income received by the lowest 20% quintile within these countries to see whether or not that growth rose during the period of globalization. And the answer seemed to be, in their results, yes, that everybody benefited from the increase in growth in the globalized nations, even those at the bottom part of the income spectrum. Okay? So by that type of measure, you might say globalization was good. It helped not just the globalized nations, but everybody, including the poorer members of society. Okay? That work, I will tell you immediately, has been criticized by, among others, Danny Roderick, very well-known economist at the Kennedy School for many years, now at the Princeton Study for Advanced Studies, a place where really smart people go. Okay? Among the things that Roderick pointed out was the issue of correlation. Maybe the countries that were growing faster already, for some particular reason, were already willing to take down the barriers to growth, and that the causality would actually run from increased growth to more trade. So Danny Roderick is a little suspicious about the simple story that I just told you. More recent work from the IMF has dealt with globalization and inequality, raising the same type of quality. And this study claimed that when they looked at inequality across nations and within nations, that what was really driving inequality and increases in inequality was technology, and the use of technology and the access to the technology. And they claim that the impact of globalization on inequality has been relatively small. It's this technology component which is much more important. Why? Because those who are educated are able to use technology and therefore are going to receive higher paying jobs. And I will tell you one very basic fact we learn in economics is that higher education is indeed correlated with higher income. So that would be consistent with what we know has been a phenomenon over time. They actually thought globalization was somewhat ambiguous. That would have different types of impacts. Why? Well, the claim was that increased trade, if it included food imports, which were cheaper, would actually help the poorest members of society. On the other hand, international investment might do the opposite, because international investment might reward the more skilled workers within a country by giving them jobs and excluding the less skilled workers. Okay? So you could tell very different stories about the impact of globalization upon these societies. Okay? Clearly, this is an area which is going to get even more research over time. So you can see that Piketty is simply the most well-known name. What is a group of economists trying to figure out what exactly is going on in these societies and why. Okay? So what I'd like to do next, before we talk any more about the studies, is to simply kind of raise a question. And I know Piketty has given part of the answer already. What I'd like to do is kind of do what Professor Lindauer did. I'm going to divide you into two groups. So maybe I'll do it differently than David did. Maybe I'll draw a line here. And Lucy and, I'm sorry, I can't see your name tag, Sahar and Zoe, you're going to be the dividing group on this side, and you guys here will be on the other side. And for the next 3 minutes, turn to the people next to you. And this group, I want to ask a question. What might be, I want to be careful how I phrase this. I'll say the benefits of inequality, or let me use maybe a better word, justification. What might be a reason why you'd say, look, we know why there's inequality, and it's for the following reasons, and there are certain impacts which are beneficial for society. So we're not pushing inequality per se, but we understand why it's there, and it's a byproduct of something we believe in. Obviously, you guys are going to do the opposite. You're going to talk to someone next to you and say, yeah, but what's the downside? What might, yeah, and right away, be careful. You might say, oh gosh, I just don't like inequality. That's not what I'm asking. Why don't we like it? What is the problem with it? Okay? So I need you to think really hard about that. What exactly is the problem with inequality? So we'll give you about 3 minutes each group. Go. So I'm sure a lot has been said. Let's try to summarize some of the main points you came up with. So let's begin over here with this, guys, and talk about either the benefits, the justifications, the reasons why we might expect to see it. I see we have our trusty microphone already. So who would like to summarize? Emma, you want to go first?
We talked a little bit about how well, in a capitalist society, which we generally think is good, especially in the United States, someone needs to have the money to make investments in new businesses. That's sort of how we think that capitalism works. So if someone has the money, then sort of it kind of follows the dark side that someone might be without money. So that is sort of perpetuating inequality.
So I'm going to take a very good comment and make it a little more technical, but I like the way you said it, Emma. One argument you will hear is that you do need savings. Now here comes the jargon to finance investment. Richer people are more capable to save than poorer people. And if we think investment does help all of society, then clearly having those people who are willing to save and invest their money in different types of investment, therefore we'll see everybody benefiting over time. Very good point. So let me write down, if I can, savings and investment. Very good. Who's next? Madeleine.
Our group, none of us are econ majors. We don't really have the fundamentals either, have yet to take those courses. But we talked about, on the flip side of the people who are saving and investing, you have in a capitalist society, the people who are picking lettuce in Salinas who may be documented or undocumented workers.
Right.
But that in a capitalist and industrialized society is almost something that you rely on. You rely on the inequality for people to do that manual labor because the CEO isn't going to come down and pick the lettuce unless it's a pick your own and cute and campy and a family activity sort of thing. Right. So we talked about the flip side of that. You almost need the inequality to get people to do certain tasks.
To do certain tasks, and I wanted to particularly talk about the CEO for a second, okay? Why is he willing to work? Now, I realize people who work out picking lettuce work very hard. In fact, my wife's from California, and I've learned a great deal about migration in the U.S. by literally going out to visit her family and literally traveling through the Central Valley, which is this great area of California. And without migrant labor, that's it. I mean, that area closed out. But if I could talk about the CEO, I'm not going to ask you to feel sorry for him. I'm going to guess she works really hard. Maybe not out in the field, but her own type of work she does. And why does she do it? Why does she work so hard as CEO?
Well, an argument, I guess, could be made that as the CEO, she or he has this big company that's providing jobs for a lot of people that otherwise may not have had the opportunity.
Why does she or he do the work? Because we're paying them to do the work. Maybe she works 7 days a week, is gone from her family, is traveling constantly. And if you said to her, you could take a lower level job and be home more, for example, she might say, yeah, but I really like the money. Okay? So a second reason perhaps for inequality is that we need incentives for working, for innovation in general, not just for working, which was Helene's interesting example, but for innovation. Okay? Suppose Steve Jobs never made a penny from the first Macintosh. Would he have done it? Don't know. He's a pretty strange guy. He just might have. He's kind of driven. But in general, we think we need incentives for innovation. Okay? So think of that more as a justification. We're not saying it's a good thing. It's just that if you incentivize people and allow them to capture part of the reward from their either work, in the case of the CEO, or from their innovation, in my case of technology, that would be a reason for saying, well, that's the price of growth. That you've got to expect some people to do well because, again, everybody does well. Very good. Anyone else on this side of the room? No? Lucy, were you?
I was going to say something along the same lines.
Okay, yeah. So these indeed are the usual, I will tell you, the usual two reasons you will hear from economists. That people who save more, invest more, that's good for society over time, and that you need to provide incentives. And the third point, I was thinking about your migrant worker. Your migrant worker may be stuck today working in the field, but to the extent that she or he stays here in the U.S., has children, they go to school, and a generation from now are a U.S. senator, which is not at all impossible to happen, that maybe as we see a turnover in people's positions, that means there's opportunities for change. And the more opportunities for change there are, you might say, all right, in any particular generation, there'll be some much richer than others. But if we jump a generation and we see a very different group of people at the top, then they've been able to benefit. And so you might say, all right, we can live with inequality as long as it's churning, as long as there's turnover. Okay? Captain?
One thing should be differentiation of skills. Like, so if someone works
Sure.
harder or if someone is smarter, then like, it might be worth it for a society to, reward a smarter
Absolutely.
person or a
Absolutely.
better, harder working person.
Again, it gets back to incentives. Okay, good job. Okay, let's go over here. So have you been convinced that it's great that Donald Trump has a lot of money? We have a microphone over here. Charlotte, you wanna go
That's
first?
not to answer your question, but I have a question about opportunities. And I understand the concept, but I don't understand how inequality creates those opportunities.
Inequality is seen as the byproduct.
Okay.
That if we allow people to benefit financially from their skill, their work, their effort, their innovation, then we shouldn't be, and now I'm going to be more serious, we shouldn't be surprised that Steve Jobs was a rich man. He truly did have a vision about technology, the use of technology, engineering, okay, that, let's face it, many people feel was a good one, and that's why the company has done so well. And so, yeah, he got rich as a result of it, but as I said, that's more of a byproduct of anything else, okay? But what's the downside? What's the downside of that? Hannah, you have a microphone? Good.
Sort of opposite to the opportunities, it's also possible that it creates more stratification if the people at the bottom stay at the bottom and the people at the top stay at the top.
Good point. I just told this charming American story about the son or daughter of the migrant farm worker raising him or herself to be a U.S. senator. It's possible she might wind up to raise herself to be a farm worker, okay? So to the extent that those people at the bottom of the income spectrum do not have the opportunities to raise up, to the extent that we have inequality not just of income, but inequality of opportunity. If there's inequality of opportunity, that really makes you wonder about the fairness of the income distribution that you say, okay? So if there's more stratification across people, if there's inequality of opportunity, we're losing the type of contributions that some people might make. What else? Anyone?
Well, I was also thinking about in the world of copyright, there's sort of an equilibrium point where there's an assumption that 14 years is what it takes for the investment on innovation to encourage like incentives to
Right.
maybe create a song
Yes, you're right. Yeah.
is what is required to sort of create that innovation. But I think to assume that $2.2 billion is required for a hedge fund manager to incentivize him to work every year, it might exceed that equilibrium point. And finding that point is sort of necessary for balancing.
Yeah, at what point does it become excessive, the stratification? Very good. Who else? Who else?
We also talked about the fact that if there's very little social mobility within the society, it makes people disenchanted with the system, which could lead to unrest.
Go ahead. Yeah, that's a good point. So one thing we know is that when you do have stratification, those at the bottom of the income distribution will feel somewhat alienated from society. If they don't feel that they can move up to become the next Steve Jobs, Warren Buffett, what have you. If they feel they are condemned within their place, okay, they will identify less with that society. They will become more alienated. And that will be a very real social cost. And so that's something to think about. So that was a very good point. Yeah, that could definitely be a factor. Can we get Sarah a microphone?
Lost innovation potential. So if you have, say, the next Albert Einstein that's being raised in some place like Compton, where those insights might not get realized, and also on the flip side, if you have someone who pulls a Zuckerberg very early on in life, they don't necessarily have incentives to keep discovering and keep using their full potential.
How many young people are there out there who, if they did have the opportunity to go to school, to do things, might turn out to be extraordinarily brilliant and do great things for society? And yet, because we do have some stratification, okay, and less social mobility, we basically are writing those people off, okay? I think it's important to understand that how we are treated very much determines how we respond. And just by coincidence, over the weekend, I was reading in a book, nothing to do with economics, an absolutely fascinating experiment that I just want to mention to you. It was done, apparently it's well known within psychology, of which I know nothing, but apparently the study was done in the 1960s. And a bunch of researchers went to a bunch of primary schools. And they got some teachers to agree to do a little experiment with them during the year. And what they did at the very beginning, they would do a test of some kind of the children, okay? So all the children were given some tests, some simple tests, I don't know what it was, okay? And then the researchers told the teachers of the children, here are the children who did the best. And those are the ones who should bloom. You know, you should see these kids doing really well over the course of the year, okay? The test was bogus. It was just a test. It didn't really mean anything, okay? But they didn't say that to the teachers. Only the teachers knew the results of the so-called test. Parents didn't, other administrators didn't. The researchers come back a year later, at the end of the academic year, excuse me. They come back months later, at the end of the academic year. And they then say, well, let's talk about these children and how they did, okay? You probably won't be amazed to hear that the teachers said, oh my gosh, those kids who you identified as bloomers, they did extraordinarily well. But of course, you've got to ask yourself, yeah, but you had some information you thought, didn't that affect you? That's interesting. Let me just tell you something more interesting. At the end of the year, they gave them a real test. I think it was an IQ test of all the children. And here's the thing which will blow you away. On the objective test, which was not the teachers' evaluations, the bloomers did better. The kids who had been arbitrarily chosen at random, and the teachers told these are going to be the ones who did best, actually did better. Why? Some dynamic in the teacher, as they taught the children, said, these ones are special, these aren't. Somehow that dynamic was internalized. Somehow the bloomers somehow came away thinking, oh yeah, I'm pretty smart, I can do this. And those who weren't getting this very implicit, not clear-cut type of feedback never felt that way. Think about the impact of that how we're treated and can be very important. Okay? So we'll finish by saying just a few things. Thank you for, by the way, your suggestions. They were wonderful. Okay? That, number one, this is not going to amaze you, inequality is complicated. It's complicated in terms of just measuring it, trying to explain how much inequality there is in the world. Okay? So we should be very glad that Mr. Piketty wrote his book, but we should also be thinking about other ways of looking at inequality. Number two, the whole notion about how globalization affects inequality is still up in the air in a very active area of research within my profession, within economics. And the third thing, how we should think about global inequality and how inequality affects us is complicated. You can think of reasons why it's an inevitable byproduct of things we believe in, such as innovation. You can think of how it might stifle more innovation in the future. Okay? So I don't have any bottom line, if that's what you were waiting for. I'm afraid all I can tell you that it is complicated. You will hear more about this, and my prediction is that you definitely will hear it in the context of the presidential campaign of 2016. This will definitely, they may not use the jargon you heard this morning, but you will hear about the American middle class, and now you know what they're talking about. Okay, great. Thank you.